Good morning, everyone. We're continuing the rezoning hearings, and I think looking around the room on the screen, everyone knows each other, so we won't do any introductions per se, except Kerry, have you appeared before us in these hearings?
Good morning, Commissioners. No, I haven't appeared before yourselves. My first time.
Okay. Yes, well, welcome. And we have some evidence from you this morning. So we're starting with Whakakotahi, and Mr. Catchpole was leading, or was it you, Kath? You need to turn your microphone on.
Yes, kia ora koutou. Good morning, everybody. I will probably lead off, sir, and Mr. Catchpole is available to answer any questions. Firstly, I'd just like to clarify I've had a fairly major computer meltdown this morning, so I'm logged in under someone else's Zoom login at someone else's desk, so I don't have everything immediately to hand, and that is why I'm appearing as Andrew Bruce this morning. So just to clarify that. The blue and black screen in the background is my desktop, and that is a fail this morning. So just in case anyone is wondering. So yes, I will lead off. Mr. Church will follow, and Mr. Catchpole can answer particular questions. Just at the start, sir, if I could, I'm reading off another screen, so I apologise, I won't be facing you directly as I am speaking. And I will just be briefly summarising my evidence as my summary statement isn't actually available. So if I could, sir, take my name and appearance as read, and just confirming the expert code of conduct is I'm familiar with it and agree to comply with it. There are a number of recommendations which the Section 42A report recommends, recommendations which I agree with, and they are listed there. Items A to G of the summary statement in my primary evidence. The only matter that I wish to address in any additional detail is the submitters which are grouped together on Devon Road and are helpfully shown in the plan as evidence on figure 2, and that is submitters 577, 578, 579, 580. They are a group of properties which are seeking mixed zoning rather than the proposed general industrial that they have been allocated. Note Ms. Gibson supports that. In my opinion, that isn't appropriate. There has been no sufficient or no transport evidence provided. The proposed zoning would permit higher traffic generation than old trip generating activities and there presently are provided. There's been no broader assessment in terms of the ability of the proposed zone to meet the wider plan objectives regarding decreased vehicle trips. In my view, the transport chapter provisions aren't well placed to manage cumulative effects, and the time to do that is at rezoning or potentially resource consent, depending on what's proposed. I accept Ms. Gibson's view that the mixed use zone probably does reflect the actual activities on site, but there needs to be a better method of managing the trip generation associated with them. I did, in order to try and come up with an alternative solution, I did consider a couple of other options there, such as a zone or a subzone, which would achieve Ms. Gibson's concerns about the sites being an entry gateway and also allowing existing activities, but also concurrently managing transport effects. As noted in my primary evidence, I haven't progressed those further. I was awaiting evidence of some or all of the submitters to see what their opinion was on Ms. Gibson's report. And I have read, where I don't have the one for Bro Devon, I don't have the gentleman's name, submitter 579. I have read his evidence. He has simply indicated that as a landowner, he supports Ms. Gibson's recommendation. So in that regard, I haven't progressed any alternative provisions further, primarily because my preference is that the zoning remains as it is. If, however, the panel wished, I would be available to work with Ms. Gibson or others if they wish to seek something alternative, either along the lines of what I've suggested or something different. That largely concludes what I just wish to say in a summary. I guess the only other thing I'll add is I have actually visited the sites in the last week and had a look around both the subject sites, the access points, and also the wider area and of that particular suburb. So otherwise, I am happy to answer questions, or alternatively, I will hand over to Mr. Church or Mr. Catchpole if you have questions for Mr. Catchpole.
Thank you very much, Kath. I sympathise with your computer meltdown. It's never fun when you're appearing to have those problems. So thanks for coping as you have for us. We also visited this area on a site visit last week, Monday, Tuesday. We were looking at various areas, and so we are quite familiar with it on the ground as well. We'll just work through any questions from the panel before we move forward. So, do you have any questions on this one?
No, thanks, Kat. I don't in particular have any questions. I mean, you've raised some quite valid points, and I mean, it's always a bit of a rush when you get a recommendation quite close to the hearing, and then all of a sudden, everyone's sort of got to work out how they approach things. We don't have any evidence from the landowner submitters. Mr. Bryant is scheduled to come and talk to us next week, I think. Yeah. And I think if he's been following proceedings, I hope that he's had a look over your evidence and is going to be in a position to sort of comment on that. I was very grateful for your suggestion for a solution, because as you know, there are a lot of things that are, despite where we began, there are a lot of things that are pushing that whole block along there in the direction of a different treatment in a way. And you would have seen the recommendation from council staff to accept the Blue Haven proposal and place over that a precinct, which just, and I clearly understand Wakutaki's position on that. So I guess the question in my mind is, we've also got a block of land right on the corner there, the Hamblin block, which at the moment, that landowner has requested that they be incorporated into that sub-regional centre zone. But the council staff have recommended that not proceed. From I guess a big picture sort of analysis of it, do you think there's some merit in adopting your approach, but potentially rolling all of those properties into a precinct approach that addresses all of the transport as well as all of the other things? So that would almost be like extending the concept of the precinct from the Blue Haven site over the Hamblin site and then down over these sites as well, albeit keeping a different underlying zoning. I mean, what do you think there's some merit in us going down that path, or do you think it's just A, out of scope, or B, just way too complex at this late stage?
Thank you, Sue. Good question. I can't comment on the scope issue without looking over the details of each of the submissions. And obviously the economic effects of having what would be effectively a much larger potential, just think about the Blue Haven activities, retail offering located in this position is also something I couldn't provide any economics comment on. From a planning perspective, a holistic approach to Blue Haven, Hamblin and this small cluster of sites would be helpful. The question for both Hamblin at this point and Mr. Bryant, obviously next week, and the other property owners there, is we don't have any information on what the transport effects might be of changing the zone. And I think that's probably the crux of the issue is we are flying a little blind, Sarah, if I could use that analogy, and that the proposal you're suggesting would enable a much wider range of activities, which would be much higher traffic generators. But similarly, if they were to work together, then there may be opportunities for outcomes which are more useful. And I'll leave Mr. Church to deal with the details, but I know one of the things we discussed was on the submitted sites that we're referring to today, there is something called Stub Road. It's a small access, slightly offset from Vickers Road on the opposite side of Devon Road. And we considered it an extremely high level potential things that could happen if those sites were developed together, and aligning Stub Road and Vicar Road was one of those things which might be able to occur if they were developed together. But if they're developed individually, that would never happen. But I'm also very mindful that the Blue Haven site has got one owner and one entity that seems to be quite focused on its outcome. If you then pop in the Hamblin site, and I think we have either 4 or 5 other submitters, might be 4 actually, on the group we're talking about today, then suddenly you have 6 or 7 different landowners with perhaps different development or no development opportunities, and coordinating that together can be tricky. Not impossible. Cool.
So, can I just interrupt? I think Kit's got his computer open looking at the area. It'd be really useful if we could see the zoning map here, Christine, while this discussion's going on.
So which one is it?
It's
out at Carterry Road.
Carterry Road near Blue Haven.
What is Stub Road? Just go back over that here. Is that road reserve?
Yes, so we've investigated, Sarah, I'll just also the zoning map open.
Let's just wait until the image comes up.
Oh, yeah, I think when we went into, on our site visit, we went into the centre via the entrance on Carterry Road. I don't think we went into Stub Road down to
At
building down there.
Yes, sorry, like, we just hold the discussion until we can actually see the map on our screen.
It's in the map tools. Okay. Move it across. That way. Drag it over. Yeah, no. Keep going. Keep dragging. All right, here we go. There it is. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
So Stump Road's a portion of, I mean, is it vested road reserve? Is that Waka Kotahi vested or is it District Council vested?
I'm not sure about this, sir, but I did have the Waka Kotahi property team check that it was gazetted road, and the answer is yes, but that does not extend terribly far into the site. If it would be possible to get the zoning overlay back up again, I did note that the road reserve did extend a little way in. Not terribly far. You can.
Yeah, it's got a blue line around it, which means it's all designated.
Right. Okay. There you go. That's the answer.
So yeah, let's assume that it's all Waka Kotahi.
Yes.
No.
So, but sir, I just for context, that was a high level example of a possible solution that neither Mr. Church or I put any great deal of thought into. But obviously there is, two side roads approaching the state highway, and if there was to be substantive redevelopment on that block of land, then realigning those intersections and making them signalised might be an option.
So that would be, presumably that would occur by Waka Kotahi would have to amend its designation effectively to get rid of the access. Presumably that would have to be with some sort of development arrangement with the landowners in terms of future access, wouldn't it?
So we were considering this as things the landowners may propose in order to develop the group of sites holistically. It's not something that Waka Kotahi is putting forward, or either Mr. Church or I are suggesting is a good solution. It's just something that might be out there.
Yeah, just for clarification, we've got the bundle of Blue Haven information, but I haven't read it yet. What was Waka Kotahi involved in the traffic conferencing for that process?
Yes, Mr. Church did. Yes.
So Mr. Church was all right. That's great. Just for information.
Okay, well that's going to be something for us to get our heads around. I think your evidence is very clear on that. The other aspect of your evidence I wanted to just touch on was the general concern you've raised with submitter 563, Kangaora, who spent most of the day here yesterday talking to us. I know Mr. Church hasn't sort of alighted upon the issue that you have raised here in his traffic evidence per se. So what we have then is a concern by you as the planner for Waka Kotahi saying that there's insufficient information on potential effects on the transport network in its broadest sense to support the proposed intensification, which I mean is fine as far as it goes, but it sort of leaves us in a little bit of a difficult position. Have you seen what Kangaora's revised medium density zoning proposal?
I haven't, sir. Was that presented yesterday?
It was within Mr. Michael Campbell's evidence, which was exchanged and uploaded at the same time as Waka Kotahi's evidence. So there is a significant change that Kangaora put to us, which, when I don't have the precise numbers, but I think it went from 700 hectares down to about 170. So that they've substantially reduced it and focused the locations around the little commercial centres and things like that. So, and I mean, on its face, when you talk about intensification, of course, the current council position is that there's no difference theoretically in the yield between the general residential and the medium density. Mm-hmm. Both allow 2 dwellings as permitted activities. So to that extent, it doesn't really matter, does it, how far afield the medium density zone might go, because it's not actually gonna, if we accepted Kaingaroa's revised maps, but not their proposal to increase the permitted activity yield at the medium density zone, all we really end up with are new locations around the city where slightly bigger houses could be built, but it would still be the same number of houses. Is that how you understand the provisions working?
I haven't reviewed that level of detail of Mr. Campbell's evidence to comment on that, sir. But if what you've suggested is correct, then that would, I think I've understood correctly, it doesn't result in any more houses, just potentially larger houses and in a reduced array of locations from 700 down to 140.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm quite familiar with Kaingaroa's approach in other jurisdictions, particularly Whangarei, where they have sought to initially a much broader swathe of rezoning and then stepped back from that as the hearing progresses, and certainly where that stepping back is resulting in a focus around transport or community or business centres, then that's something that I would be reasonably comfortable with, particularly if what you've described is correct, and I'm sure you've described it accurately, and that there's no additional houses, just a different shape and form.
So that I guess that's one of the propositions on the table. The other, though, is, of course, Kaingaroa are asking for the medium density zone to move from 2 dwellings permitted up to 3. So in that scenario, that does have an intensification impact, not only because it would relate to the council's proposed medium density zones, but also to these additional areas. So I guess that's where we're sort of in a bit of a quandary in terms of the concern you've raised about a lack of a broad integrated traffic assessment to analyse that implication. And I don't immediately know what the answer is to that. Mr. Campbell attached to his evidence a memo from Mr. Langwell from Traffic Planning Consultants. Although, to be fair, I don't think it does what the level of analysis that I suspect you might be contemplating. It's more of an indication that these locations are on good public transport routes and all of those sorts of things. Yeah, so I don't know what the answer is there.
So, look, I think from a process point of view, all of the parties, including these 2 Crown agencies, have had every opportunity to follow the process around their interests, and we just don't have any evidence on that matter except from a planning comment from Kath in terms of those medium density issues. So we can only look at making a decision based on the evidence we receive. So that's my analysis at this stage anyway.
Okay, well, let me approach it a slightly different way. If all of the proposed areas that Kaingaroa and indeed the council have identified for medium density generally follow main and established transport routes and are generally well connected to CBD in terms of walkability and alternative mobility, is that enough to give you comfort that there aren't potentially going to be network-wide transport-related effects from this?
So I don't have it immediately at hand, but I recall there is a Waka Kotahi submission that generally supported zoning as notified in the plan.
Yeah.
So there is an acceptance that there will be growth and that the areas that the council has identified were suitable for that, along with the general provisions. You'll see that I certainly haven't provided any evidence on the detail of the residential density or any of those other provisions. So in that regard, you could expect a level of comfort from what was notified. If it helps, I will file with the administrator the submission number after the hearing, if that's of use to you.
Oh no, we can track that down, and it's a matter of record. So the issue then becomes if those density provisions were extended in the manner sought by Kaingaroa to add another permitted dwelling in the zone, and also to extend the zone, albeit within locations that still follow major transport routes. Is that still going to be a concern in the absence of a detailed analysis?
At a high level, I would just say that following transport routes provides good car mobility, and it may also provide good public transport connections depending on what's available in the area, but it doesn't necessarily follow that it will provide good alternative or active mode connections.
All right. Well, thanks. Yeah.
Yes, David.
Good morning, Kath. Commissioner McMahon speaking. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
That's good, because we had some issues with audio yesterday. I think we're better placed to the microphones today. I'm definitely interested in this concept of a precinct and what conferencing might follow out of that. But given that in the future, I just want to query you on some of the aspects of the submission as it is in front of us today. Firstly, I just want to acknowledge or get some clarification from you that this is a single issue dealing with transportation. You're not raising any wider planning issues in terms of the fit of the mixed-use zoning in the scheme of things in this locality.
Are you asking me if I have an opinion about whether this area should be a sub-regional centre or not?
No, I'm asking you whether you think, aside from traffic matters, whether this site or group of sites should be a mixed-use zone in terms of fit with the existing activities on the site and the strategy for the mixed-use zone and the district plan. I mean, this reporting officer at paragraph 71 has said that the activities that are on the site currently are predominantly retail and commercial service ones. They're not industrial activities. So in her view, there's a misalignment with the industrial zone, and the home zone for these sort of activities is in fact the mixed use zone. So from a zoning fit point of view, she's of the view that transportation matters aside, we'll come to that in a moment, this is the best zone. Do you dispute that?
No, I don't see it. I think I have acknowledged that. I'm scrolling through my primary evidence to look at that. So I do agree that.
Yes. And I think in your summary of evidence, your paragraph 1.4e possibly touches on that in terms of the term best fit.
Yes. So that's why I have considered alternatives, because I agree. I think I have made a review of the operative industrial zones and the operative plan. I've also considered the evidence of council staff who are much more experienced with this plan than I am as to the fairly open nature of the operative zoning and how that has resulted in a range of activities which traditionally probably wouldn't be found in a more stringent industrial zoning structure. And as a result, there are situations such as this group we're dealing with where there are more mixed-use zone activities located in an industrial zone. So I understand the history to that of that to some extent, and I don't necessarily disagree with Ms. Gibson that these activities would more normally be found in a mixed-use zone, and that's why I've looked to ways to manage the effects. Leaving it, if it is to go mixed-use, then how do we manage the transport concerns?
Yes, and that really brings us on to the transportation matters, and I acknowledge that compartmentalising the questions into zoning and transport ones are a little bit academic, but I just wanted to get that on the record. So moving to transport matters, and I'm conscious we haven't heard from Mr. Church, but we've read his evidence in a summary. I guess first and foremost, I was really interested in knowing how the Kotahi position on this side relates to position in the past on the Blue Haven resource consent application and the Blue Haven proposed rezoning to a sub-regional centre. And I wondered, does this site raise any different transportation challenges than Blue Haven resource consent and the Blue Haven rezoning? And Mr. Church might want to answer that.
If I could
Yeah,
defer to Mr. Church, thank you.
I'll take control of this one.
Just before you do, Mr. Church, were you involved in any way in the resource consent application by Blue Haven?
I wasn't involved directly with the resource consent, but I have been involved throughout this hearing 22 process, in particular the joint witness statement, the conferencing of the transport experts, and going over the actual resource consent outcomes, in particular the conditions that have led to the discussion with regard to the provisions put forward for that consent.
Yes, because the reason I asked that is I was very interested to see that what the Kotahi had given written approval on the Blue Haven resource consent application. And I wondered on what basis that had been undertaken. And secondly, whether those matters were replicated in the Waka Kotahi position on the rezoning proposed by Blue Haven.
I think the two sites are very different. And when I talk about sites, the Blue Haven site relative to the group of sites that sit within this particular block. The Blue Haven site does have essentially 3 road frontages with Cartier Road, Smart Road, and obviously Devon Road. It's also got the ability to, I've gone through and looked at the effects. I've done a transport assessment of the site and its proposed activities to understand what form of mitigation is required, whether it be road capacity, walking and cycling improvements. The one obstacle with the current sites for the upper side of, I guess, Devon Road, talking from I think it's 660 through or 670 through to 700, is that when you look at the sites and you go out onto site, each of these sites is quite restricted in terms of its access. So at Stubb Road, which is the access point into the Turner site or the camper van site, that's actually got no right turn out. You can right in, you can turn left in and left out, but you can't turn right out to go towards to head out of town. In relation to 700 Devon Road, which is the top site, you can only turn left in and left out. And with regard to the, I guess the Palm site, the main access where you've mentioned that you visited the site the other day of Karteri Road, the one outcome of the Blue Haven development is they've proposed an upgrade of that Karteri Devon Road intersection. But as set out in my evidence in chief of the Blue Haven site, if you've managed to read that yet, the actual resource consent assessment has provided an upgrade of that Karteri Road intersection. However, it's at its capacity. It's operating at level service E, level service F during the peak periods. What that's telling us is that there's, based on the proposed development of the Blue Haven site and the mitigation they've proposed, the mitigation is sufficient for their development, but it's going to really, well, it's not going to enable or allow further intensification of the neighbouring sites until such time as we understand what their access is and what their trip generation is relative to their proposed activities that they foresee. And hence my position of, I agree with Ms. Happlethwaite in terms of doing a master plan or doing an overall precinct for the area allows us to understand what, how the area can develop as the sites are combined rather than individually, because individually they don't provide good access. But if combined and looked at comprehensively, may be able to achieve a better outcome in terms of access and therefore also understand an outcome of what the mitigation is to enable development.
Thank you for that. So what I'm getting from that is that I guess the structural arrangements of the roading pattern need to be fundamentally looked at, in your view, and holistically. Is that it in a nutshell?
That's correct. Yeah, they're very different in terms of their current access.
Yes, and does that predict predominantly from a capacity aspect or a safety aspect, or both?
Both because of the current turning restrictions. Obviously, that's going to lead to potentially illegal U-turns or unsafe travel behaviour in order to try and get into and out of these sites to where people want to go if intensified.
Yes. and this, I think Blake might want to come in on this one. The reporting officer has said, well, look, the activities that are there currently are the ones that are going to be facilitated by any future mixed use zone. And any intensification to business and retail activities will either require a discretionary or non-complying resource consent in this location. And associated with that, they'll probably trigger the high traffic generation trip rule, which requires an integrated traffic assessment. So if accepting that is correct, what would the this wider transportation study achieve that the integrated transport assessment couldn't deliver on, or any individual resource consents triggered by a future MUZ zone?
Perhaps I will answer first, if that's okay. I think you'll find in Mr. Church's evidence and my assessment, we've made a comparison between the current zoning, which is the industrial zone or proposed zone, the existing activities on the site, and also the mixed use zoning. And we don't necessarily agree with the conclusion of the reporting officer, particularly in regard to the trigger points, or firstly the range of activities, and secondly the trigger points at which rule Tran 10 of the transport chapter, as in the section 42 reference, as that would be brought into play. There's a number of activities on the site, and I'll ask Mr. Church to deal with this in more detail in a moment, which simply wouldn't generate enough vehicle movements to trigger that particular provision. And the attachment 1 to my primary evidence gives the summary of currently general industrial zone activities and compared with mixed use zone. So there's a ready reference there. Terry, do you want to talk further about your trip generation?
So just before we go off that though, you're saying that you dispute some of the matters raised in paragraph 77 of the officer's report, which talks about the type of activities that would trigger consent, and you don't believe that the trip generated figures that would necessitate an independent or an integrated transport assessment would actually be triggered by an individual activity? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and that is correct in most circumstances, sir.
Okay. Mr. Church, putting that to one side, let's assume that the ITAs are triggered. And what's the essential difference between what an ITA would deliver on a resource consent application that did trigger a need for a resource consent, either as a fully discretionary or non-complying, or triggering a trip generator? What's the essential difference between an ITA on that individual activity and the sort of study that you're suggesting is necessary for this area?
I guess for my answer to the ITA question, it depends on to the extent of the site that's being set or proposed. Is it an individual site or is it a comprehensive site? As an individual site, it would be very looking at particular just the access of that particular development on the network. Whereas what I'd like to see through a precinct and through a wider comprehensive development is the sites combined and developed comprehensively, which would be a very different ITA, because you'd be looking at the cumulative effect of the sites and the cumulative way in which the sites gain access to the network. And that may, in my view, through some form of master plan, look at how each of the sites are connected to provide that comprehensive access to the site for all modes, rather than just getting into and out of an individual site on an individual proposal. With regard to just to help or assist the panel, in table 1 of my evidence in sheaf, I provided a table which set out the number of trips that would trigger those R10 thresholds. I guess the key ones for me is that commercial services allows up to 1,000 vehicle trips before triggering that ITA requirement and the actual activity status. Now, the current site, whilst it's got activities that lend itself to a similar zoning, they're very low traffic generating activities. And being to the site, and I'm sure when you're out on the site as well, there's not many people that use the site during the busy AM and PM commuter periods. It's during the weekend, it's likely to be a bit busier given the garden centre and so forth, but generally speaking, these sites are very low traffic generating activities as they are. And hence why, I guess, in terms of enabling further interpretation of the site, that would also enable a lot of very different transport response in terms of trip generation.
Thank you, appreciate that answer. And I do have your table 1 in front of me.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Just one question from me, Kath, and it's very evident to us that this block of land is stressed in terms of its activities. Some of the buildings aren't currently utilised. I presume that restricted access in and out is causing that to a large degree in terms of getting activities that are going to work there commercially. So whether or not whether or not the council deals with this whole area comprehensively or not, is going to continue to be a site that will be under planning pressure in terms of the inability of the current activities to really sustain themselves. That's my observation. Would you agree with that?
So I'm not really sure I can comment on the impacts of leasability or business viability based on access. I do agree the access is definitely limited. Mr. Church has already described that. The other thing I observed when I was going past the site at about 4 to 5 on Tuesday evening is that there's substantial queue back heading into the city, which I think would further limit access or people egressing the site at least. You'd need to wait for someone to let you in at that time of day, at least based on my singular experience, but I imagine that's probably quite common.
Yeah, I was really seeking your experience as a planner, looking at the zoning, the site, the access. Yes, I'm not asking you to go on a limb, rather than just
Okay, sorry, perhaps I misunderstood.
What you see yourself.
Yeah,
as a planner, that's going to continue to be challenged for any activity because of that lack of good access.
yes, and I think
we have similar areas all around most cities where the connectivity from major roads are constraining activities, and yes, certainly happened at Te Rapa in Hamilton. It happens State Highway 2 into Napier where I live. These sorts of areas. So look, I just want to establish that, and I think we will come back at the end of Mr. Church's evidence and have a discussion about where to from here, including Mr. Catchpole. So let's hear from Mr. Church, and then we'll reflect after that. Thank you.
So I feel like I've gone through much of the evidence already and the questions, but we'll start from the beginning, I guess. Obviously, my name is Terry Phillip Church, and I have provided evidence in chief for this hearing. I've been involved with the process alongside Kath. I have visited the site and I've provided a summary statement that you've obviously been through. I guess ultimately the issues have already been discussed, and in my mind it comes back down to not having a understanding of the transport effects associated with the development, what those effects will be in terms of the wider area of the network, not necessarily just outside the front gate, and that's coming back down to the fact that access is restricted. So you are going to be pushing U-turns further afield, or you're going to be pushing traffic further afield to allow them to complete their journey. There is going to be an increase in traffic generation, as we've just talked to, and I've provided a table in my evidence in chief that speaks to that. Currently, the site is very low traffic generating in terms of its activities. I'd suggest, as I've got in table 1, somewhere between maybe 100 to 300 vehicle trips, but I'd say at the very lower end of that range. but that can be substantially increased based on allowing for the change in activity status, particularly around that commercial services activity. But yeah, until at such time as a comprehensive assessment has been undertaken for the sites, given the current, I guess, challenges the sites have individually, but also collectively, because there isn't yet a transport response that looks at the wider sites if they were to be developed comprehensively together. But that's what I would suspect would be the outcome of a comprehensive transport assessment, which would then allow for a good solution from a transport perspective, which I'm sure then satisfies the land use obstacles or the intention in that zoning. But my involvement in the Blue Haven discussion, as well as I'm involved, obviously, the Hamlin submission as well, that this part of the network is congested. Congestion does lead to unsafe traffic behaviour or behaviour of motorists. It's also quite disconnected in terms of its walking and cycling connections about the wider area. So all those elements need to be captured within a comprehensive study, in my view. And if they are done so, then I've got no problem, along with Ms. Hepworth, in terms of providing a precinct with those matters similar to what Blue Haven have done down the road. But I'm happy to answer questions if they haven't already been done so.
Thank you very much, Terry.
Thanks, Mr. Church. My ears pricked up when you said that there was an agreement to upgrade the Carterry Road intersection as part of Blue Haven. And I must say, I'd assumed that that was Smart Road upgrade, but I'm just feverishly going back and having a look at their consent documents, but I don't need to because you're here now. So is there a proposal? Are they going to signalise the Carterry Devon Road intersection?
Yeah, that's right. So there was 2 intersection upgrades required, depending on the staging of the development. Now we've tried to decouple that staging development that out, and well, that was a feature of the land use consent for the actual provisions that are now proposed and have been worked through for the actual precinct itself. But Carterry Road is proposed to be signalised. It does provide for pedestrian crossings as well, which isn't currently a feature at the intersection. So that is being agreed upon, and that is now included in the provisions as it was in the land use consent.
And just looking at the proposed precinct plan there, there's a main site entrance to the Blue Haven site of Smart Road, but there's also 2 vehicle access points on Carterry Road. Are those ingress and egress, or just egress?
I believe they're in and out, but I don't have the plan in front of me. I can get it quickly, but from my memory, one's related to staff, I think, or back of house and servicing, and one's related to essential. So I don't think that while they are providing access to the site, I don't believe they provide the key access to the Area B parking areas. That they've got separate areas for staff, and potentially, as Mr. Brown, who's the Blue Haven's transport expert, suggested that might also be the location of some transport hub that they're looking at. But we can address that on the Blue Haven one, but they aren't, from my understanding, the critical key access points that provide access to those Area B parking locations.
Okay. So if the Carterry Road intersection is going to be signalised, doesn't that actually solve a lot of the issues with potential redevelopment of the sites further north?
No.
Isn't Blue Haven effectively by upgrading that intersection create capacity for more vehicle movements?
They do, you're correct by it does create more capacity, but then that capacity is swallowed up by the Blue Haven development. I would agree that the signalisation of the Carterry Road intersection provides an improvement in terms of safety by taking away the actual giveaway movements and the conflict of those vehicles, providing priority not only for vehicles but also for pedestrians. But the capacity gain through the signalisation is actually then swallowed up by the Blue Haven development itself, by the access, because the key access point to the Blue Haven development is actually further down Carterry Road. where there's a new connection that goes into what would be the large format retail area, or the so-called Bunnings site, which has been what was assessed through the resource consent. So the two little access points that you have on Karteri Road, which is essentially opposite 680 Devon Road, or this particular site, whilst they're not going to be the main trafficked areas, the main trafficked area is going to be coming further to the, I guess, to the south. But it's because of the signalisation, and as we've mentioned, Devon Road is very busy. And it's very busy no matter what time of day it is, in terms of in the morning or the afternoon coming into town. So there's still going to be a capacity constraint, but the signalisation of this of the Karteri Road, Devon Road intersection would only benefit 680 Devon Road, because that's the only site that actually has access to Karteri Road in its current form. The sites further to the north, such as Turner's and the pipe works place, which is at 700 Devon Road, are still separated and can't provide access down to Karteri Road. They've got restricted access onto Devon Road themselves.
With that stub road.
The stub road is only for Turners and the camper van, but the actual 700 Devon Road only has left and left out access, which is the site further to the north. As you come down the hill into the area, you can only turn left and left out. You've got a raised median on Devon Road. So that site again is separated. So that's really speaking to my concern that all these sites individually all have their constraints, apart from 680, which is the one right at the bottom, which is, I guess, offering an ability to get out onto Karteri Road. However, there's no capacity at the intersection at Karteri Road in relation to the Blue Haven development swallowing all that up following the improvement.
So essentially, unless there were some additional improvements that, let's take the hypothetical, and that group of sites came with a proposal to effectively align itself much more with a mixed use concept, a redevelopment, for example. We're at a situation where the Karteri Road intersection's been signalised. Blue Haven's taken all the capacity out of that, as was predicted. So what are the options available for this developer then, in terms of the mitigating additional traffic impacts on the network? I mean, you can't make more cars go through a signalised intersection, can you?
No, you can't. But what you can do, from my mind, is actually provide a safer outcome for the complete site as a whole. So as we've spoke to earlier, and I certainly haven't gone down the track of assessing what the transport outcome would be, that would be the function of an ITA and a transport study. But there are options available in my mind. For example, as we spoke earlier, Stub Road currently provides I guess, a central access point, and it's very narrow through that road, I guess, once you enter the site. Once you enter the site at the Turner site, Stub Road finishes, and you're straight into the Turner's access, or the car park, I guess, of the camper van. But with Vickers Road and Stub Road there, you might look at options as to what you can do in providing a comprehensive access point off the state highway, and have some form of internal road. Well, you could make it a 4-way, or you could make it a tidier 3-way, because you've got the obstacles of the demand coming down the hill and the queue back that occurs. But you could also provide a internal road, internal, I guess, access road that links all these sites together, therefore gives each of the sites options to either access onto Devon Road through some form of formalised intersection, or make their way down to Karteri Road and turn left or right out of Karteri Road. Yes, there is, I guess, an understanding right now through the Blue Haven assessment that there's not much capacity left there. But you've got to look at it all in the round, I guess, and things chop and change. But until you actually know the detail of the site and get it laid out into looking at what the modelling represents in terms of where we anticipate the demand to be, what that demand is, and therefore what capacity is on offer through looking at other access options. I'm not saying that you can't, there's an option there, there's an opportunity, it just hasn't been looked at yet.
Does Waka Kotahi have any longer term aspirations in respect of this stretch of state highway? I mean, obviously it's agreed to tolerate the Blue Haven proposal because some upgrades have been put forward. In terms of that stretch though, and the stub road and the left in and left out for the site slightly further north, is that an issue for Waka Kotahi that it has on its to-do list that we need to think about how we're going to resolve that for the longer term, or is it simply it's working as it is, as long as we can control each individual proposal that comes on and we get sufficient mitigation, it's sort of very low priority for us to worry about. And that might be something Mr. Catchpole.
I'd let you point that question to Mr. Catchpole, but I would say that through the Blue Haven development and the anticipated widening along the corridor, Waka Kotahi has been open to looking at the improvements along this corridor that can be made to facilitate the proposals put forward. But maybe Mr. Catchpole can provide further context in terms of what the anticipated outcomes are further to the north.
So I'll just let you know, Mr. Catchpole has sent me a couple of messages saying that he is unable to turn on his video. But Alan, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. I'm sorry to be a voice out of the blackness. So far as I'm aware, there are no major proposals for this stretch of highway, but its performance is at a level which draws attention to itself, and minor proposals can always be worked up, and I would hope are being worked up. In terms of access to the properties and what Waka Kotahi's position might be in relation to development proposals, it is basically one that you've seen with Blue Haven, which would consider proposals on their merits, and in the hope that actually a redevelopment project in the area might create some improvements. But I would have to say that we would be very interested in seeing concentration of access rather than dispersal and increasing access points. If that's clear.
That's helpful. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Kit. David?
No, I won't want questions.
Yes, so have mine. Look, what I'd like to do, there's a couple of things I'd like to discuss, procedural issues with the commissioners, based both on this particular issue and whether we might want to look at a broader assessment from a traffic perspective and what that might mean for the parties. I'm very aware that we're getting to the end of our hearing program. Probably a fair bit of fatigue around the place in terms of opening up this particular issue broader. So I think if you could just reflect on the pros and cons of that, both from Waka Kotahi and the council's perspective. We'll take a break now. I'll talk to the commissioners about this. I'm also reflecting on the Kainga Ora upzoning request for medium density, and I've just had a brief chat with Commissioner Littlejohn about the value that we would have in Kath, you and Terry having a look at that and perhaps providing us some advice with some supplementary evidence. And again, I'd like to chat with the commissioners about that. But if we break now and come back at 10:15, we can take it from there. Thank you.
Yes, sir, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. That's great. So we have had a discussion about two matters. The first one is on the main discussion around the site north of the Blue Haven site on that Highway 3. We are hearing from Mr. Bryant, who's one of the landowners. It's Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday?
It's Thursday.
Thursday. And obviously any sort of process we embarked on would need to be in discussion with him. But Kath, we do see some value in perhaps you advancing your, can you hear us, Kath? You look like you're struggling to listen. Hello?
Yes, sir. I've just come online. I'm sorry I missed everything you said before.
Okay. That's all right. So we have a discussion about two matters. The first one is this site, industrial versus mixed use zone north of the Blue Haven site. The first thing is we don't feel that there's any real opportunity or reason to sort of try and broaden out the overall Blue Haven traffic assessment into a wider precinct plan. That just goes too far to us. It's late in the piece. That was going to be thought about, would have needed to be done comprehensively, and we just don't have time for that. But we would, and we also are aware that Mr. Bryant's talking to us next Thursday. So we wouldn't want to make any sort of process decisions without his involvement. But in the meantime, Kath, we would be interested in you progressing your thinking a little bit more and with Mr. Church, just around the idea about if it does go to mixed use zone, what might be a traffic trigger for this particular site that could be built into the rules, in terms of perhaps is there a different activity status for this area that could be identified by a rule of some kind, which would require integrated traffic assessment, even with the lower thresholds perhaps in play, and whether you had any further thoughts on that. That would be a step in the direction that we could consider if you did want to put something else on the table.
Thank you, sir. We'll give that some thought. What sort of report back mechanism would you like us to engage for that and timing?
Well, I think we'd like it before next Thursday when Mr. Bryant appears.
Tuesday.
Sorry, next Tuesday. Sorry. Yes.
Tuesday.
So we've just heard Mr. Bryant's coming on Tuesday. Is it possible to give a little bit more thought to that between yourselves and report back to the hearings administrator by Tuesday morning?
We can give some more thought to it, sir. I guess we, Mr. Church and I had a discussion during the break about this, and we were slightly concerned. I mean, we can definitely assist the panel, but we were concerned that Mr. Bryant and the other landowners, we wouldn't want to be seen to imposing something on them that they weren't involved in, given the collaborative nature that we have been approaching the hearings with. So yes, we will assist. We will provide you with some commentary, but we are mindful that we don't have a view from the landowner as of yet as to their position on such provisions, like yourselves, of course. Okay, so yes, sir.
You're just picking up on your suggestion that there might be some solutions which we could look at. If we had that on the table on a, I suppose, without prejudice basis, that we could talk to Mr. Bryant about, and certainly the council planners and their traffic advisors, they'll be able to look at that and build that into their right to reply. If there was a mechanism you could put forward to assist us.
Yes, sir, we will do that. I guess also just to reiterate, our primary relief is that the general industrial does remain.
Yes,
so
yes,
yeah.
yes.
Okay, excellent. We'll do that, sir.
Could I just add to that to assist? I guess the question that I'd have in terms of forming that or providing some guidance in that space, really does come down to also the willingness of all of those separate landowners in working together. And so they'll be interesting on my part to understand it, because if they're not willing to work together and provide a comprehensive outcome and stick to their guns in terms of looking over their own plot of land, that makes for a very different outcome as well. And I'm not too sure what the deal is right now in relation to what's tied up in leases and what long terms and what short term and what and so forth. But it's just it'll be interesting to hear from Mr. Bryant in that space as well, rather than just individually what they have as a collective consortium, I guess, of ideas.
Well, yeah, I guess I mean that's fair comment, but to some extent that's for the landowners to resolve, and if they can't resolve it, they potentially can't take advantage of the rule. I mean, just I guess thinking out loud and not wanting to give away where we're sort of thinking. There's two potential mechanisms within the mixed use zone. For example, hypothetically, if this block went to mixed use, you could have a specific development standard, which would, for those blocks of land, require a certain outcome before they could take advantage of those activities. That's probably not ideal, because there are permitted activities that would require some form of process, which is a bit clunky to deal with when it's a permitted activity. So the other option may be a specific rule that's simply applied to activities within this area of the mixed use zone, much along the lines of what Kath sort of hinted at. But it would sit within the mixed use zone and would be a bespoke rule that applied to these sites. And those sorts of rules are not uncommon throughout the plan. There are a couple of other situations where you have a rule within a zone that makes specific requirements for sites within the zone itself. So that's sort of where we're thinking. We don't sort of, and it comes down to what the content of it be, what would the trigger be, and what would be the outcome required. And ultimately, if it applied to the whole block, it would mean that whichever of the landowners essentially wanted to take up the opportunity first, then they would have to then spearhead an overall assessment to deal with the entire block being reutilized. You know, I don't want to go much further than that.
Yes.
It's just some ideas there, I think. Yeah.
If I could just add to that, because I think, Ms. Hepworth, the issue for us is how do we give effect to what Kahati's concerns, and I guess you've had on it, your primary relief is don't change the zoning from industrial to mixed use. Another way of doing it is to change the zoning, but provide a bespoke solution on the transportation matter. And that's why I asked you the question about ring fencing this as a transportation issue. So all the chair is suggesting is that we have a sequential exchange of ideas, starting with Whakakotahi in terms of what that second solution might look like. Share that with Mr. Bryant and co on Tuesday, and then get a response from the officers in their 42A report, and they may decide to enlist their own traffic advice also, or may decide to conference to provide the solution. So it's really one of fairness in exploring that second method of achieving Whakakotahi's relief.
Yes, we'll provide something to you. Yes, thank you. Thank you for your guidance.
Yes, and certainly from our perspective, we're really appreciative of Whakakotahi providing us this sort of opportunity to look at a solution in a plan review like this, because we are setting a scene for a long planning period. So it's great that you've turned your mind to some possibilities, and we'll glad to take up the opportunity. Just on the second issue about the Kaingaora upzoning of areas from general residential to medium density residential. We had a full day yesterday with Kaingaora, and they presented an updated planning or zoning map, which identified about a quarter of the area that they're originally seeking for transition over and above what was proposed in the proposed plan for medium density housing. They'd also talked to us last week about the residential zones, where they were also seeking this 3 houses per site versus 2 houses per site. So as a package, they're seeking an extension of the mixed, sorry, the medium density residential zone as notified, plus some additional density rights as a package. We would be interested in our decision making with if Whakatahi, given your stated support for the proposed plan is notified, to look at those and give us some addendum evidence on that matter. It's quite a key issue for us. And we would really appreciate that as both as decision makers and just any advice you might have us on their revised proposal from a traffic perspective and a state highways perspective particularly, prior to, and so us having that information and also the reporting officers having the benefit of your advice on that key issue as well. So in terms of timing, that's not quite as pressing, and we'd probably just seek your advice about, what would be a reasonable time frame to look at that, given your interests, and come back to us with some specific evidence.
So perhaps I might confer with Mr. Catchpole and Mr. Church on that, and we could suggest a time to the hearings administrators later today.
Yes, that will be fine. Again, it's just really on an assistance role to us, because we've got quite an important decision to take, and certainly the interests of the whole network, including the state highway network, does interest us.
Yes, sir, happy to assist.
Thank you very much. So the only other thought I had was whether you coming back and talking to us or being available and listening into Mr. Bryant's evidence would be of assistance. I think it would. Would that be possible?
Gone on mute.
Do we know what time Mr. Bryant's on Tuesday by
Yes,
chance?
he's the last submitter on Tuesday.
And do we have an indication when that might be?
We could keep in touch.
Yes. So even if one or two of you could just listen in, Julie, our administrator, said she'll just keep in touch with you to see how we're going, if that's okay.
I
Yes,
am
sir.
free this afternoon, so that's fine for me.
Yes, and I could make myself available too, sir.
Thank you very much. That's been of considerable assistance. Appreciate your advice. Thank you. I think we're going to move on now to the next Madam Miranda Williams and Ms. Onley. I think we're here to address us. Good morning.
Have you had an opportunity, commissioners, to read the submissions, or would you like? I'm happy to read them through.
We have read them, so
Should I?
I'm just thinking from a ease of reference point of view, we might just perhaps look at some of your plans on the screen and we can talk to those.
Does the hearings administrator have the technical capability to put?
There's a new system here since you were here, Sarah, and
The answer is yes.
Good job. Which plans would you like me to?
well, yeah, just look at Sarah's legal submission.
Well, we did go out and visit the site. Sort of general community locations. That's quite helpful.
Yes, so should I, I'll move through the plans then. Now, Mr. Strata, is it possible to make that slightly so obviously and actually, Mrs. Williams here is of course much more familiar with the site than I am. But, so the proposal for rezoning to general residential is outlined there. And, as the submission stated, a application for a 2-lot subdivision was made for this site in 2016 and was declined. That was considered as a non-complying activity under the operative district plan, under the rural rules, of course. So the topography of the site is such that it moves down relatively steeply from this land to the Tihanui stream, which you would have observed on your site visit. If we move to the next map, I've called it a triangular piece. It's from Saxton Road, between Saxton Road and Carrington Street, it's called there, where the residential zoning stops on that side of the road. And you can see there that it's rural zoning to the south. And then if we move to the next map. Now, sorry, Julie. Thank you. I will ask actually, do you feel comfortable just outlining the extensive development, Mrs. Williams, on the other side of Carrington Road now?
Yeah, you can see my property at the bottom of the screen there. When we built there, it was all fields. I mean, there was one little old house on there, which they've since moved. And since then, we've had pavements put in, street lighting put in, and as you can see a lot of properties being built across the road and down it's there, it's marked as Kindberg Road, but it's actually, what was the other?
It moves into Fernbrook Drive.
At Fernbrook Drive, it's been renamed, and all down that hill now, they're all buildings are going up there. So that's now a bus route. And when we built there, we had sewage, lighting, telecommunications, all the services are in there.
Yes, so the further submitter, on obviously Mrs. Williams is supporting the notified plan rezoning. The further submitter's property is down the bottom of the hill there, where actually Mrs. Williams used to live, as she will outline in her evidence.
Can we just put a ring around that one?
That's 479, is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's the big house at the bottom there, is that right?
Yeah.
Can we just move the mouse just so that one there?
Yeah.
Yes. So that's the further submitter. Yes.
Mr. Van Duren and Miss Osmond. Now, you would have seen that the main implication of my submission is that the test for considering the rezoning are quite different from considering the subdivision application in 2016, which was against the rural zone.
Surprised it's non-compliant, because I thought to spread everything in the rural zone was discretionary at worst, but there'll be some technicalities about that.
Well, it depends how many titles have been
Yes.
moved off since this particular date. I think it was 1999.
Oh, it's called by that date, that's right.
Yeah.
Okay.
How many lots was the subdivision for?
One. Well, my property and one more.
Okay. What's the area? The site?
6,000.
Now, it may assist you if I neglected to hand these out earlier.
That is Twigley's evidence.
No, this is Mrs. Williams' evidence.
Oh, okay, all right. Good.
So attached to the back of that is
Oh, I get you. All right.
the subdivision plan. So, as a non-compliant activity, of course, the issues including precedent arose together with Well, it's been a moot point, the extent to which the operative district plan discouraged subdivision in the rural environment. And I think coming through to this plan, the council officers have expressed a lot of concern that there has been ad hoc subdivision in the rural environment in New Plymouth. And that's actually been my observation through various hearings I've been involved in as well. So to me, it is quite surprising that this particular subdivision application was declined, but of course, no one's questioning the robustness of the procedure that occurred at that stage. All my submissions are intended to say is that we're under quite a different test now with the National Policy Statement Urban Development and the strategic direction that is attached to the submission, which we haven't made submissions on yet. But that's what we must test this against now, not the previous district plan provisions, of course.
Or the operative, there's still.
The operative, I meant, that's what I meant. Would it be a convenient time now for, I can come back to the section 32 paragraphs if you wish it, yes. Paragraph 12 of my submission, but might be a convenient time for Mrs. Williams to outline the factual.
Thank you.
scenario.
That would be really good. So welcome, Ms. Williams. Certainly, I'm very happy for you to read your evidence, or but it might be more comfortable to read it through.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so my name is Miranda Williams, and I'm recently fully retired. And I support the proposed plan as notified, which would rezone my land at 479B Carrington Road from rural to general residential. From 2003 to 2010, I lived in 479 Carrington Road, where the further submitters now live. My husband and I downsized after subdividing 479B subdividing, and we moved into 479B Carrington Road in 2010. My husband passed away suddenly in 2017. My current property, comprising 6,483 square meters, is used as residential. The land is too small to generate any form of income. I have arranged for the property to be grazed free of charge in an attempt to keep the weeds down, but not very successfully, as you will have seen. If the rezoning of my property is approved, I intend to subdivide the property for the purpose of providing a secure retirement. I'm in my 69th year and I had managed to keep working on a part-time basis until recently. However, I now have a sister in the UK who is terminally ill, and I gave up my job in order to travel to help care for her. And I'll be going back to the UK again in a couple of weeks to continue that. My late husband very much wanted to subdivide the property to see us through our retirement. And now that I'm on my own, I feel it to be even more important. In January 2016, my husband and I made an application for a 2-lot subdivision of the property. A copy of the scheme plan showed the proposed subdivision is attached to my evidence. Mr. Van Duyn and Ms. Osmond opposed the application and appeared at the hearing. At the time, the New Plymouth District Council long-term plan identified Lower Carrington Road as a favoured and preferred area for future residential expansion and development. So it has been flagged for residential opportunity for some time. The subdivision actually was a non-complying activity and the application was declined by the independent commissioner. At the time, BTW and Quillam were assisting us with the application. Mr. Twigley's evidence prepared for that subdivision application attaches geotechnical report determining that there is a suitable building platform were the site to be subdivided and on-site stormwater disposal available. As also pointed out by Mr. Twigley, the site is fully reticulated. It has water, sewer, gas, electricity and telecommunications, has rubbish collection incorporated in its rates, and has a high standard of roving. From Mr. Twigley's earlier evidence, I draw your attention to the following paragraphs, which I think would you like to read that now? Or?
No, we've
You've heard that?
familiar with those,
Okay.
so
I'll move on.
thank you.
I note that the above was written in April 2016, and since then there has been extensive building and consolidation of new properties on the other side of the road to me. And in addition, a new entrance to Fernbrook Drive has now been opened up to provide a second access to the ongoing residential Huatopa development. This is opposite my property to the right. The postcode has now been changed from rural to residential, and traffic speed has been changed from 70 kilometres per hour to 50, as well as now it's on a bus route, as I mentioned earlier. And at this stage, I have not retained a planner or to prepare any further subdivision plans because I don't wish to incur further expense until there is more certainty in relation to the proposed district plan decisions on the proposed general residential zoning of the site. I would like to address the previous and strenuous objections made by Mr. Van Duyn and Miss Osmond. Mr. Van Duyn and Miss Osmond's property, which is a long way from the road, is enclosed by a number of trees and bushes which shield it from being overlooked. I know this because, of course, my husband and I used to live in that property. Their primary view is across their paddocks and land to their southeast, which is the opposite direction to my land. In addition, they have planted very fast growing and very tall shelter belt along my entire boundary and across the top of their hill, which in pretty short time will block my current view and that of any properties developed on my land. So in summation, we are told we increasingly need to extend the city's capacity for housing. The subdivision of my land will provide a prime residential opportunity for others and provide me for my retirement. Sitting on the city boundary as I am, I believe this proposal to extend the residential zone is simply part of the growth of New Plymouth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Williams. That context is very helpful to us. Do you have any questions?
Yeah, just a couple. Looking back at your 2016 proposal, it was for a single lot, just over 4,000 square metres.
Yes,
The general residential zone now has a minimum lot size, 400 square metres. So potentially, assuming you wish to keep 1,846 square metres for your existing property as a larger lot, the balanced lot could potentially support maybe 6 or 7 new lots. Would it be your intention to allow that much to be developed on the balance?
Well, potentially, yes. I don't know at this stage. I just want to sort of move on and get this through, and you know.
I only ask because, of course, part of the rationale for supporting the zoning is that there is a need for more housing, and to some extent, it would be a bit wasteful if, having been zoned for general residential with the capacity for 6 or 7 lots, it was only developed for 1. To some extent, it wouldn't be a very efficient use of the land.
No, my only concern with getting 6 on there would be the topography of the land, because it does have quite a sharp fall away.
Yeah,
so
those
whether
are
that
things.
would be possible or not.
Yeah,
Obviously, I'd like to.
Well, there'd be other factors that would come into it. You've got soil stability. You've got access as well. Presumably, where was the proposed access to this new lot? Was it having directly off Carrington Road, or is there a right of way
like
down?
the properties opposite, they have their individual drives in. I would
Okay.
assume that that's what we would do.
Look, Commissioner, I'd have to go back and have more of a look, but of course it would comply with the.
Yeah, there's a myriad of standards that would now apply to all of those
That's
things.
right.
Yeah,
And
okay.
as Mrs. Williams said, I think there would be some topographical and geotechnical issues
Yeah.
with the site. I mean, one of the, and as she said, she hasn't had a planner or surveyor up to the site since
Since then, yeah.
since 2016.
No, that's understandable. But, yeah, okay. No, I didn't have any other questions. Thanks for coming along and doing this. We haven't had any evidence from the further submitter, as far as I'm aware. So, but I think it was.
I-
Okay.
I think if you give us some maybe online, but can I just say that thank you so much, but we asked to be heard out of order due to things. Mrs. Williams is going overseas, and I had other commitments. I did also actually just want to point out a couple more things.
Yeah, well, we haven't finished yet.
Okay.
We've just been
Well,
talking
are
to-
you on? You're on questions to Mrs.
Yeah,
Williams.
that's right. That's right. And I mean, I just wanted her to make sure she understood that the zone would enable more than what the original proposal was for, and that obviously that would have to be dealt with if the zoning was carried through. Thanks.
Thank you, Mrs. Williams. I have just a couple more questions for you. Can you recall when the speed limit was reduced on the section of Carrington Road?
I think it's been reduced for 2 or 3 years now.
And was it the development on the other side of the road there?
Yeah, it's very condensed along there, and of course it was very fast at 70.
I know you're not a traffic engineer, so I'm going to ask this question with a bit of trepidation. What's your observation of what the actual environmental speed along there is? It's one thing to have a posted speed limit,
Yeah.
but do the cars hoon along there, or do they?
It's taken a while for the traffic to slow, but now it's sort of pretty much accepted. We did have quite a lot of police presence up there in the early days,
Yes,
and then occasionally you get one whamming through, but mostly they comply.
yes. And did I hear you say that it's now on the bus route?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it comes down through Fernbrook, because the Sunset Retirement Village is on Fernbrook Drive, and it comes past there and circuits up across from me and down the main Capital Road.
Where's the bus stop? Is there a bus
There's
stop
one
on
at
Carrington?
Fernbrook. No, we haven't got one at the top, I don't think. I haven't noticed it.
And your neighbours, how do they access their property?
Their drive is at the far end of my land.
Yes.
And they drive and it goes down around my boundary.
Under the transmission corridor. Yeah.
Do you have a time frame in mind for the possible development of the lot, residential, if the zoning is moved?
I would love it to be completed and that I can move on and make plans for my future.
Yes.
So as soon as possible would be
Yes.
lovely.
I guess the option is you to subdivide off the land that you don't require and sell that and let someone else take up the initiative.
Probably, I don't know. I think it might be a bit much for me on my own to deal with actually subdividing it off. I don't know. I'll have to take advice on
As long as you can help, she's good.
that.
Look, that's really useful. It's good to hear from you in person on those matters.
Can I just ask, do you notice the power lines? Do you hear a hum? Do you?
There is a hum
Yeah.
in the wet,
Yeah.
but I don't really notice it where I am. But certainly when we were down below, we noticed it more.
Yeah.
I think I noticed it now.
And does it?
Maybe I just got immune to it.
Thanks for that.
I just have one other question of clarification. I see on the McKinley survey plan that there's some road to vest was proposed. Was that was really not to restrict access, it was more to, must have been at the time, the council might have needed some more road there, I'm not sure. You know, just be there.
I did read that it. You see, you can come in off there. You could come in on. I have a sort of a bit of a driveway in front of my property,
Yes.
and that's sort of surplus land. Really, you can't can do much with that. But it does provide an access
Yes.
on my turn.
It looked like there was a right of way proposed coming in there, so the access in this plan was from the right of way over there. That
Yes.
northern part of your land.
Yeah, yes, that's right.
I think there was also.
Oh,
Yeah. Yes, no,
Yes.
I'm sorry, I can't assist further with
No,
that.
no, I was just interested. Thank you. And Ronnie, I think it's back to you to finish, to sum up.
Yes, so can I, if I can turn to page 5 of my submissions, I won't take you through the full commentary against the section 32 report items. But I thought it was quite interesting that in the section 32 report, it says sites could not be used for further residential development except through a restrictive resource consent process. And so the evidence of the 2016 application that was declined is absolute evidence that supports that. Obviously, the submission is that it would be a highly appropriate place because it consolidates urban boundaries, and there's no reason to stop the residential zoning before Mrs. Williams' place. I do wish to just make 2 further points. Paragraph 18. The only reason here not to accept the rezoning appears to be a not in my backyard argument made by the further submitter, and the National Policy Statement Urban Development is specifically designed to move away from such arguments. And then, if I can just read paragraph 21. As recognised in the NPSUD and in the proposed plan strategy direction, people can no longer expect their environment to remain unchanged over time. And ultimately, such thinking would fail to provide for the district's housing needs. And I've cited there the relevant objective from the NPSUD and the relevant part of the strategic direction and the footnote there. So those are the only points that I wanted to draw out from the submissions.
Thank you very much, Sheila. If you have any further-
No, I don't. That's very helpful.
Thank you for me.
Yes, so very clear. Thank you both for coming along, and we'll hear from the further submitter another day. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Safe travels to see your sister.
Thank you.
Right, Ms. Hanson.
Provided video which we were unable to load online due to its size.
I love a good movie.
It's just a little bit of drone footage.
Yes, well, we'd like to see
Do you
that.
want to show that before you start, or introduce yourself first?
I could introduce ourselves and then perhaps look at that. Thank you. I'm Tanya Hanson and I am the property owner. I'm also a planner. I have a small planning matters that I would address in my evidence, but fairly minor. Here with me is Phil Dickey, a registered surveyor and a resident from Awakura for how many years?
40, I think you said.
Yeah, and Sean Husband is an engineer for a company.
Thank you.
Just on the servicing side, so yeah, might be a good start to have a look at the video. I guess the purpose of showing this video is just to show the proximity of the land to the Awakura village. So the land, just zoomed
Are we
past.
coming from the north?
Yeah, it might be helpful if on the other screen you pulled up the district plan map.
Yeah, I've got it.
And then we can perhaps replay.
The access into the said land, the
Yeah.
subject land is the track you see coming up on the right-hand side of a hedge road, the shelter belt.
along this side of Shelter Bell.
Yeah, along the right-hand side as it comes down into Donnelly Street.
That's Donnelly Street that we
Just
see
there,
now.
and that's the school, just at the end of the driveway and the tennis courts.
Oh, yeah.
And then sort of just down from the school, is the play a game, maybe just pause it at the end. Thank you. There is an aerial photograph that might be, perhaps pull up the aerial photograph. That might just cover a lot of it. It was sent as a separate attachment because I couldn't email you the file size as well.
Not attached to the evidence.
No.
really.
Separate bill. Yeah, that appendix.
But that's not open, Julie, maybe, I think we've certainly got a pretty good idea of where
Yeah,
you
from-
are.
even just the district plan, that would be helpful to put that on it.
43.
Just before we do that, there's a technicality, but I see you've signed the code of conduct.
Yes,
You're
I was
giving-
going to declare that I've got a
Yes.
conflict in doing that being the landowner.
Well, I think it's just a subtlety. We're very interested in your opinion, but you can't give it to us as a
Expert, yes,
expert planner, but
yes.
that doesn't derogate from what you're.
Yes, I was going to raise that as a key item, so thank you for pointing that out. I guess the only two planning matters that I pointed out were that the council planner has incorrectly identified an ECA and a stream being in our property, and they've now been recognised as an error, so that's probably the only two planning matters I've really included. So I've been addressed, but as a landowner, I take my evidence as being read, but I guess I've also grown up and lived in Owakura most of my life, and it's unusual that this property has been given a split zone under the proposed district plan, given its proximity to the village amenities. You want to be able to provide residential land where kids can walk to school without having to cross the main road, or, you know, have that issue with increased traffic areas and things. So the land is located in a great location in terms of accessibility, and I guess Owakura has a little bit of a village feel like that, like a lot of people are walking or biking, there's a lot of cars all the time. Parking around the school is an absolute premium, so they've got a real push for properties for people to be able to walk through the schools and that side of things. The council planner in the section 42A report pointed out that the land more fell into the Surrey Hill, Wairau, Upper Wairau lifestyle area, and I guess that area is more like a kilometre and a half from the Owakura village. This land is, you know, 150 metres from the school and 500 metres from the village amenities, and so to me there is quite a distinct difference there. The Surrey Hill Road area is accessed sort of off the main road and quite a distance from where this land is. I guess as the crow flies it is a little bit closer, but in terms of accessibility it's quite different. But the key things I wanted to point out, if I could hand over to Phil and Sean.
Before we do that, Julie, could you bring up zoning? If you could.
Can I ask some questions?
Yeah, sure.
What was the zoning of the property under the operative plan?
Future urban development in the part that's now zoned rural lifestyle and residential, and the part that's zoned residential.
And you live on the property, presumably as a sort of a lifestyle lot.
Yes.
Okay. The back portion, I guess the flat bit that's been retained as rural lifestyle. What was that used for? Is it just a really big backyard?
I have horses.
Oh, okay, all right.
Yes, and cattle, so we graze it. It's grazing land at the moment.
Yeah. The margin of the river, what's the bank like? Has it still got has it got a good vegetated riparian margin, or is it?
Yeah, very, very good. That drone, perhaps if you
Oh, yeah,
play that
actually,
at the end and you can really see.
I think
But
you
it's,
can give us a link to that, that'd be quite good.
yes, yeah, perfect. I
There's
sent
an
it through.
esplanade strip laid off as well.
Oh, okay. Well, this is one of the properties I think we didn't go and have a look at when we were looking around, but it might be one we'd be quite keen to go and have a look at, I think,
Yes.
given there is a contest about the zone.
There, yeah, like there is obviously a flood risk and
Yep.
the biggest flooding event in 30 years, the previous owners had mapped, and so we have all of that information that you need to account for, and any development down there, but there's certainly a large area of land.
So I've got the cadastral, you can see the cadastral line up there at the moment with, so there is already a vested, is it an esplanade reserve or an esplanade strip?
Strip.
Okay.
And the entire river bank is planted.
Okay.
It's probably on an average about 1.5 meters high. The bank itself.
Yep. Okay. The property to the south of yours, yeah, that's the one with the SNA on it. Do you know if they made any submissions on the plan at all?
Narrow land? Not that I'm aware of. We actually lease it.
Yeah.
And a lot of people own it.
Okay.
We've tried to purchase it in previous years, and it's they're not a group that talk often or anything. I doubt that they've submitted anything on it.
Okay.
Certainly not that I'm aware of.
I think that the only reason I was interested in it is because if we accepted your request, we'd end up in a situation where there would, I guess the general residential zone would go all the way down to the edge there, and then you'd end up with these slithers. But presumably it's RL said under the SNA, and that continues to the south anyway off the Wairau Road property. Okay, no, that's just some initial questions,
Is the
Stephen.
foot zone along a terrace feature?
Generally, yeah, not exactly.
All right, Mr.
The area that's got a bit of bush on it is actually quite steep. Sort of to the right of the dwelling, whereas down near the river, there's a lot of flatland down there. That area there is actually, there's a steeper part there where you wouldn't develop anything. So it was only that paddock in front of the dwelling and sheds that you'd develop for residential.
Sorry, just within that little surrounded by where the trees are.
Yes, yeah, it's too steep to build on the bush area
Over there.
over there. Yeah, so it's unusual that part form part of the residential instead of other parts of the property.
Yeah. Well, it's something we'll get a bit more sense of if we go and have a look.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we put the. Thank you, David.
So what do you think the yield of the property would be if, from a development perspective?
Number of allotments. We've been looking at that and the width of, if we'd look to vest part as road and right of ways and things like that, but you'd probably be able to get 5 lots up the top and 6 down the bottom, so maybe 11.
That's already residential at the top.
Yes. But the minimum allotment size is looking to change in the proposed plan from the operative and things like that, but roughly 11.
Yeah, that's at 600, is it?
Yes, I think currently 800.
Yeah.
But going down to 600, so assuming that goes through, 11, maybe 12.
And presumably, if the portion that you've identified, the river flat portion, wasn't suitable for development, what would be its logical long-term sort of.
It'd be nice to allow a walkway, like there's some beautiful swimming holes down there, and allowing some sort of public access and a walkway for, for people to go down and enjoy it.
Would you presumably lay out the development in a way that balance parcel formed the ownership of one landowner, or would?
Yes.
Yeah.
I would say that one allotment, just a couple of things, the roadway you see that's set off from Donnelly Street.
Yep.
is Set off at that stage so it could be a legal road, and that would be extended up to where you see a little track coming down the river terrace.
So that's a 20-metre wide.
No, it's was the minimum road width allowed for under the plan at the time, in 2017. And where your arrow is there, just there, that's where a right of way would start and come south down that track that you see. So there is some restriction, but that really is only suitable for a right of way to come down the river terrace. So at the bottom there, currently it would provide for 6 lots. One of those lots would incorporate the river flats, which can be prone to flood. And that area of bush you see would include that as well. So it would deal with that, but you'd put right of ways through to allow access to the river.
Yeah.
Pedestrian right of ways.
Well, that's obviously a matter of future thinking in detail about what someone might like. You either create much larger lots and give everyone a slither of that river flat and create a public walkway over it, or you give it to one lot to some extent. But anyway, those are well off. I mean, the first early phase is persuading us that it ought to go to The two key issues that were raised in the 40 report not to support this submission were effectively topographical and infrastructure constraints. Is that how you read it?
Yes.
Yeah. And to some extent, we've got evidence from you on both of those aspects, and I guess we'll get to hear them at the time.
Yes, I look forward to discuss this.
Any questions? Yes, before we go to Mr. Dickey. Mr. Dickey, we'll hear from you now.
I've lived in Kura Village for over 40 years, so I know the lay of the land pretty well. And I always thought there's plenty of building sites down on that river terrace, which is proposed to be zoned rural livestock. That's what it's proposed to be zoned. But I really feel it's better zone residential in consideration of desire for more housing sites like that. So I just point out that from that land down on the terrace there is it's very close to Donnelly Street, and it's walking distance to the school, which is less than 100 metres without crossing the road. And also on Donnelly Street, you've got the play centre, tennis courts, and it's also an area where all the kids go to catch the bus to go to high schools in town. So it's pretty central for the young people. There's walking access down Donnelly Street and into Hussey Street along the back there, and direct access to the village centre, where there's all the cafes, chemists, doctors, etc. So that's a 5-minute walk from this land, so it's well connected to all the education facilities, the sports facilities, and for the aged, it's even close to the cemetery. So it's well connected.
Not far to go.
Coming back the other way, if you come up to Donnelly Street and head south, and you come onto Wairow Road, there's an easy walk to the Kaitaki Forest. And then access to the beach, if you proceed down Donnelly Street, across the main road, you're straight into Matakai Reserve, which has walking access down to the beach. So it really lends itself to be part of the residential land in Auckland. I only have one other or two other things. There is a correction in my written submission that I mentioned that Ian's in paragraph 4.6. That Ian Steele was going to submit on services, but in fact it's Sean Husband. And we'll take it that you've all read my written submission, so I'll leave it there.
If any
Yeah,
questions?
Julie, could you just zoom out a little bit and show us where this walkway down to the beach is? From Matakai Street, do you know what Mr. Vicky was going about?
It's that green belt, you come along Donnelly's, yep, that one there, there's a walkway through there.
So you can get, so you've got to get across the highway.
Cross the highway and then walk down that reserve and you pop out just along from access to the beach.
Any other questions?
I just have a question of clarification from the officer. Just wanted to know what the minimum allotment size in the rural lifestyle zone is.
The 4,000.
Yeah.
There's a balance. Yep, 1 hectare balance.
You got to have a minimum of 1.4 to get it underway.
Yeah. Each time. Yes.
Correct.
What's the size of this?
What's the size of this?
We have 1.8 hectare.
For the total allotment or for the rural lifestyle component?
Total area
Yeah.
3.8.
Yeah, for the rural lifestyle portion is 1.8.
Yeah, and 2 for the general.
2.5 for that.
I have no questions for
Mr. Vicky,
Vicky.
thank you. We'll hear from you then. I had no questions either. I really have some questions for you, Mr. Husband, but can you please take us through the highlights of your evidence?
Yeah, sure. So essentially, as you pointed out, the main concerns within the 42A report were around infrastructure. So I was requested just to have a look at it and see how the site would be serviced, I suppose, against the development standards. I suppose I'll take my evidence as read, but I'll work my way through it to refresh everybody on it. So I suppose the site includes some topographical and geohazard constraints. So there's a really steep escarpment along the northern side of the property, which is raised before. I think there's 30 metres of elevation difference between the upper terrace and the lower terrace. And then also we've got the Oakwood stream running through the bottom of it. I suppose there's been some record from previous landowners of the high tide mark, but there, to my knowledge, there has actually been extensive flood modelling done on the stream to determine that. But overlyingly, there's still going to be, I suppose, a significant area which will be elevated down there and expected to be flood free.
This issue was probably the key issue for me.
Okay.
We have a question about whether hydrological modelling of the Okua stream.
No.
And also thinking about climate change events. We're dealing around the country with areas that have been rezoned that are now looking at adapting through coastal and flood events. So I think we'd have to be very, very comfortable that any potential residential zone was free of predicted flooding risk.
Yep.
So you haven't provided that.
No, we haven't done that assessment. We've only done a desktop assessment of it.
So what are the desktop assessment mean?
As an assessed, I suppose, the topography, had a look at what the upstream catchment is, but not done it, dived into detail
Why
So we've recommended-
why is that, if you're seeking a residential rezoning to allow buildings to go there, why isn't that? That seems to be the key issue. Would you agree?
Yeah, it sounds like it. What we've said is essentially we've recommended that that would need to be done. We've been evidence here, we've recommended that that would need to be further defined as part of any subdivision application to set minimum floor levels. However, as I've mentioned, there's significant difference in elevation across the site. So I suppose there's 30 metres of elevation to work with, and while some of the lower terraces are low lying, there's still a lot of that lower land which is significantly elevated from the stream bed. So that was I suppose the basis of recommendations that we believe it would be feasible.
For the staff, any advice from hydrological flooding perspective in relation to this rezoning and forming your opinions?
No, we haven't. The land's not shown as within a stormwater flooding area.
Yeah.
There's no flood modelling which has been done.
So there's no overlays in the regional plan?
No,
No?
there's been in the last few years they've updated all flood modelling within New Plymouth district.
And
Within New
this
Plymouth,
doesn't-
but no, good.
Not, oh, that's
Yeah, we're not-
probably hasn't been.
We're not showing any overlays.
No.
Also that
it was considered a factor.
Yeah.
A potential factor.
Potential factor.
So if you turned on flood overlays on that plan, where would be the closest flood extent shown to this property?
On the other side of the highway.
Is it the blue hatch?
It's blue horizontal lines. You need to turn it on because remember it's a non-district plan layout.
It's down the bottom.
Yeah.
Of there, it's not.
So just next to Great South Road.
Yeah.
On the corner of the school site, actually.
If it's any help, adjacent to the river, in some areas, it is prone to flood. And one anniversary weekend, many years ago, biggest flood we had, it really flooded Wall Terrace, which is down nearer the coast. And I surveyed the high tide mark along the river at that point, and that's recorded on some of the records.
They're going to 1 to 4,000.
But from the terrace, the land rises up several meters, and it continues to rise, and it's that area that we see as being suitable for residential. Yeah, if you had a field inspection, you can quite easily see that.
Yeah.
Or even on the GIS overlays contours, you get a much better view of what the new district plan is.
We need to go.
Well, we do need to have a look at it, but we also need evidence. If it's not on the flood, what I'm hearing is that it's not on a flood layer, it's the flood mapping, but this catchment hasn't been modeled in any detail. Looking ahead in terms of climate change or.
I would have to speak to some of our engineering staff just to find further information on that, but beyond what's on the maps, I'm not sure.
Is this one of the reasons why the staff aren't supporting this?
No, we
It's not.
didn't cite that as a reason. We cited infrastructure and the contours, the topography helped drop down steeply.
So you don't have a concern with the flooding issues?
We didn't, I mean, I would have a concern now it's been raised, that there's no work being done on it. But I didn't look at it as a reasoning in part of my assessment.
Here's the issue there. I mean, I've just been involved in a plan change request in Palmerston North, where the site is subject to flood extents mapped in the district plan.
Yeah.
And so the question there is there any physical impediment to the zoning change occurring? And so the requestor has done a lot of work around that to reduce the flood risk through earthworks consents, such that the flood overlay can be removed as part of the plan change. In this case, we don't have a flood overlay. We know that there might be some instance of flooding and ponding. I guess the question is that of such an issue that it becomes a major impediment to the zoning, or is it something that can be done through due process, through the resource consent process, through minimum floor levels and the like? So that's the quantum of the issue on flooding that's in front of us. What camp does it fall into? The major impediment camp, or something that can be managed
I think because it's not shown on the maps, the significance of the scale, we could probably look at addressing it through the consent process, but I'd like to see some sort of an assessment to ensure that there's not going to be any impacts that we're not aware of.
How extensive? I mean, I can understand why you'd say that, but have you been consistent in requiring that information on all rezoning requests, which might intersect with a potential flooding issue?
I'm trying to think of
Because
of another one that would have to deal with that.
that where the site is not shown as being mapped as a flood extension in the
Yeah,
Just
I'm
on
just
district plan layout.
We've had any, can you recall any others?
The natural hazards chapter would create a trigger.
Yes.
Having said that as well, there's a standard in the subdivision chapter that requires each allotment proposed in a subdivision to provide a stable flood-free building area suitable for building foundations in accordance with the building code acceptable solution B1A.
And if you don't, you trigger to a fully discretionary.
Yeah, and obviously you'd have some sort of reserve which would give you a setback as well.
Yeah, so
So that would,
in an application to subdivide, you'd have to demonstrate your building platform. So to some extent, there's a method there.
yeah.
But with the district plan, it's not signalling, hey, this is a known flood area.
No,
Correct.
it's not.
No, that-
Correct, so it's information that's coming through from the landowners.
But the district plan doesn't do that across the board anyway, because as we know, it's an imperfect model.
Correct.
So this is effectively the last bastion really to ensure that you don't put houses in flood areas, because in a way, isn't it?
But I think that method there sort of provides a reasonable method on subdivision. It would have to be shown.
Oh yeah, on the application,
on
you'd
the
have to put an
application.
engineering report in,
Yes.
which shows the modelling of the flood extent and that your building platform is going to be.
Yeah, that stormwater management plan would normally be provided
Yeah.
from a subdivision.
Yes.
We need to specify for
Yeah. Okay.
four
No,
levels
that's been
and
a-
support any subdivision layout, which was proposed.
Yeah, that's been a good discussion. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, could I point out the flat, what I consider the flat land on that map?
You could, you can do that if you want to approach
Just for your general information.
Get a blue pen and draw the lines horizontally. Save council $10,000 in the flood modelling report.
Here we come down the terrace, and this continues to fall, but the flood area, this is quite elevated all through here and here. So I think the highest flood we ever saw was about here, around here, through about there. And then this is high here, and it comes back around, and I think it flooded up to about there. So there's still plenty of.
Did you say you did some surveying, high tide surveying?
If we have that map, I don't know if we're producing it now.
You know, you could.
Pretty much shows that line I just said.
You might want to stay up there, Phil. Another question.
How do I send that? Sorry, do I need to send
Yeah,
it?
Just a Julie.
Julie, okay.
So Phil, there must be, that would suggest there's a bit of undercutting by the river and stream through there and some erosion of the banks, is there?
No, it's always a well-defined bank, it's never moved.
Right.
In fact, it's all planted here with large trees now, grown, and tends to contain it quite well.
So taking into account the area that you just indicated that's subject to potential flooding, are you saying that would need to be taken account of in terms of the lot boundaries and the lot yield for that?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. You put the building sites back up here on this elevated land around here.
And do you still maintain that the yield would be around 6 for that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, currently, the right of way only provides for 6 lots, and there's ample land in that.
So to some extent,
That's a
right,
height line
but
there.
the major constraint. Yeah. That's the question. What you might, sure you might be able to help me. What AEP event do you model for For the volts?
Yeah. So 1%, so 100.
Yeah, 100,
So,
yeah.
and then there's a freeboard of 500 millimeters above that.
Okay.
And that 1% AP's got to be able to have amounts of climate change in it. So it's actually, it's relatively quick and easy to work out as a first principles assessment of it. And then you can go into as much detailed hydraulic work as you like to fine tune it.
Yes.
It's interesting. Best contemporary practice in the hearing I heard last week was 1 to 200
I am
to take account of climate change.
4404, I suppose, outlines all your standards. So it's very clear in there that it sets out the level of service and level of protection requirements.
Yeah.
Within that, it's
1% plus 500 plus climate change.
1%, including climate change.
Okay.
At 500 millimeters.
On top of that, all right.
And
So
that's
which might be close to 1 to 200.
Yeah, well, it's too uncertainty. But 500 millimeters.
0.5% AEP event, goodness.
Certainly, where I practice around the country, they're getting more and more conservative with these
Yeah, definitely.
flash floods, the regulations. But I think we would really value a visit.
Yeah.
And I think if we could arrange that through Julie, because, you know, this area does, sort of interest us. 11 sites given the MPSUD, if it's in the right location for
Well
the
connected.
good, well connected, we're certainly interested in turning our mind to this. So I think we'll finish the evidence, but I think we will want to have a look, which would be useful. Thank you. Sorry, Scott, I interrupted you.
No, that's all right. It's interesting, yeah, because from my perspective, I'm least concerned with the storm flooding aspect of it. So we've had a little look at site access. It's obviously accessed up Donnelly Street. Donnelly Street is a 20-metre wide road reserve, and the road is generally constructed to E12 standard road, which is generally suitable for 200 properties to be accessed off. And the intersection of the North South Road is fine. The actual access strip, which leads into site, Phil mentioned before that it was sort of left as a 12-metre access strip, which was met the minimum roadwork requirements at the time when the subdivision was done. That 12 metres has since increased within the revisions of 4404, the latest land development guideline, to a 14-metre minimum roadwork, which would allow access of up to 12 lots. That, I suppose, in our assessment, 12 metres is suitable to achieve the same intent, essentially, to be able to physically get a road access and then create pedestrian access and providing services. And if that was to become a sticking point, which I don't expect it wouldn't be, there's the option of utilising the land adjacent to it, which is also provided as residential, to form a feasible access in there. It's sort of been mentioned, access to a lower terrace. Any Eastern Council Road, there's a gradient requirement on it. So it's unlikely that you'd even be able to shape access down into a lower terrace with the Council of Eastern Road. Hence we need to go to a right of way and restrictions to that 6 lots in that lower area, which has been discussed.
So the current track sidles down the terrace.
Yeah, but you could, but by the time you cut a 15-metre wide road reserve
I
down,
understand the current track we can see.
yeah,
That sidles down.
and that's at an appropriate grade. Just from a desktop assessment, it looks like it's at about 17-20%. You're allowed to go up to 25%. Standard, so that essentially would form right away. So yeah, generally there was one point which was noted is that Donnelly Street doesn't have any pedestrian access extended down the end of it. It ends at the school, and then at the end of Donnelly Street there's also a shared pedestrian walkway which goes down into the Mattacai Reserve. So it would be nice to have at some stage just more development area for pedestrian access. So jumping onto wastewater, it's located in the Shira Wastewater Reserve or wastewater catchment. The site serviced with a 150 mil need a gravity connection, which would be suitable for any additional flows from the site. That 150mm would be able to be extended to the upper bench and provide a gravity connection for any lots which were developed up top. Any development down at the lower level would obviously not be able to gravity to into it and be required individual for a pumping system to get up and into it. However, that's common when it's constructed privately and it's done all over the ship. So it's with that over a shared pump system or they come up with individual pump connections up and so generally, concerns such as wastewater downstream network is suitably sized for any additional development in there.
So you normally see the council require pumping up to the gravity system in a situation like this?
Yes, and that's particularly council don't really like taking on pumping systems themselves, but any privately owned pumping system would sit privately owned within the right of way. It would be a private asset, and it's really common practice. Capital gravity connections are very lot in the world.
They will be dealing with sinking tanks or anything like that. It's just wouldn't be.
No, and it would be suitable down there, but with the proximity of the waterways and
Thank you.
Water supply. So the site is located in a water pressure zone, and it fronts 100mm single bed water main on Donnelly Street. That water main extends, I think it's roughly 500 meters down to South Road. So essentially there's a large connection here to the council articulation. Development on the site would require extension of that existing main down the access leg to provide service to any residential development. And the key part there is that it would be that any residential development requires any firefighting code of practice. And generally in a development like this, your firefighting code of practice is what calls the maximum demand for water supply. So that would be sort of a governing case. Any development would require installation of fire hydrants and so forth down there. One of the fire hydrants down there to provide firefighting. One, generally, probably in terms of infrastructure constraints, water supply would be to me the largest concern in terms of servicing new development here. Typically, off a 100mm main, you start getting quite a lot of high losses, and you struggle to meet your firefighting requirements just off a direct single feed. There's calculations and so forth that need to be done as part of the subdivision application for it. What if it was, so I suppose our desktop assessment is that it may be marginal. Yeah. What we've suggested is that there's alternative measures which are readily available, which would be in the form of extending the main on Donnelly Street through Wairau Road via the Wairau Road, via the paper road through Wairau Road, and that's a relatively straightforward process. It's council owned land. That's sort of be another, I'm not totally sure on the length, but maybe 100, 200 meters of water main, and then all this cost as part of any subdivision. With that again, without the assessment on it, we'd expect that would provide suitable service for the area.
They require a private development agreement with the council, or could it be just done through the subdivision?
No, it's just done through. There's a requirement at the time of subdivision from the requirements of firefighting code of practice. Infrastructure needs to be installed, we just go through. This part of the development approval process. So it'll need to be it will be used with council ultimately. So that
the key is it will be a development cost.
yeah, it can be on share agreements that there's other people that are getting it. Yeah, it's not a council requirement to provide it. But again, I suppose, alternatively, you can provide on-site storage, so rather than upgrade to mains, you can have there with a fire engine would go in and hook up to all the water. So, point, I suppose, where we landed with it is that it's perfectly feasible solution that meets your development standards and development. Or we assessment, if stuff hasn't been done, it needs to be done for resistance.
Thank you, Sean. That's helpful. Kip, did you have any?
Yeah, just to, I guess, just to, not on the infrastructure stuff. I mean, I think fairly straightforward ultimately in terms of responding to serviceability. Just it's quite an interesting site, which is to some extent the reason why one size fits all doesn't really work, because the site's got some unique attributes to it. Just a couple of things from it in terms of connectivity along the northern side of the Ohakura River. Just looking at the zoning, you can see there's an esplanade strip that starts up, looks almost like a little bit of a gravel bank, much further up the road. Is there a general walking track along here that people use?
No, not currently. Trail question will come up there.
Yeah.
But at the most northern point of the subject land,
Yeah.
just along there's an incredibly on the
Just where the
east
green
side,
bit is.
there's a very high escarpment there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Bit of
So
an
you've got to sort of cross the river.
All right, because there is a little bit that's open space zone there, which is presumably a reserve that was vested at some point, just on your northern boundary there. You see that?
Yeah.
But from there, even though there's an esplanade strip, you're saying that it's pretty impassable to get down onto that flat area and continue around.
Yeah, it may be possible to create a track, but currently there's no access. But it could be possible.
If I mean, yeah, hypothetically, where would it lead you to? You'd end up following.
River mouth.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, just down 500-600 meters downstream.
Yep. Okay. All right. Yes, sorry, Dermot?
We could potentially get the contours up showing that, if that would be helpful on the screen.
Oh, if you like.
Yeah.
Here we go.
Just for the benefit.
I guess the other observation, and it's quite interesting because, of course, when council do sort of yield analyses, they look at it like a flat piece of paper and divide the land area by the lot size, and you end up with quite a significant amount. And what you've said to us effectively is that this parcel of land, it can't support that level of development, but it potentially could support more than the rural lifestyle zone. And I mean, I just did the math on a site size of 3.7 hectares. 12 sites means the average site size is about 3,000 square meters. So those are even, those are just shy of the rural lifestyle zone minimum lot size of 4,000, but significantly larger than the low density residential minimum site size of 750 square meters. So it's rather a unique proposition to some extent. You'd end up with a zone that yields significantly less potentially if we accepted your request than what it would otherwise theoretically enable.
It's just with that rural lifestyle zone and the minimum allotment size, like the area of land to develop that is flood free and that sort of thing, you have to go smaller than the 4,000.
Yeah.
The number of allotments down there, even though the when you run it as an average, there's plenty of land to play with. It's just avoiding those steeper areas in the floodplain.
Yeah, that map's really good, both to understand the flooding, proximity to the bank, and how the access would go down the track. But yeah, that is really steep over that side, isn't it? You can see the flooding, or the area that Phil pointed out in terms of flooding. Sort of follows
What's that
those lower
contour line?
contours.
There's that orange line, which is probably
The darker red one. Are those meter contours there or half meter?
No, that'd be.
Those would be meter. That's a meter contour.
Yeah, I think those ones you could 5 meter contours. So.
Okay. All right. Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah, so
That blue one was the flood extent effectively.
The one below the red one would be about where you would stop any residential development.
And that's really helpful. I think I didn't have any other questions.
Thank you. So a couple of things, if you could send us a link to the video.
Yes.
There's a survey plan that you said that you've done. Just give us information on that. And we will come on a site visit, hopefully on a nice day, but we do have some ability over the next June. We may have an afternoon. So we'll get Julie to engage with you on that.
Just lock up the horses. Stephen's afraid of horses.
No, he's still right, mate. He's on. So like me too.
Thank you.
No, thank you for coming along. Thanks, Dermot. Is that on the GIS?
That's on the council internal, which uses the operative district plan.
We don't have.
We
It's a
don't
plan,
have-
no. Why?
So that's us for the day. So we will adjourn Monday at 9 AM. Louise is
We've got Richard Bain on today. Did you have any questions? Because he couldn't make it yesterday.
on your yesterday.
Sorry?
Oh, and his evidence.
As evidence, I mean, he also did the rural lifestyle evidence. So whether you had any questions in relation to Tanya Hansen's property
Yes.
in the rural lifestyle versus residential, if you wanted to ask Richard. please, yeah.
Mr. Bain, your evidence was very much focused on a response to Kaungora, as I read it.
Yes.
In terms of their original.
The original submission.
Colour the district red submission, as we call it. And then also, in terms of the evidence you gave on the rural lifestyle zone, it was more a direct response to certain submissions you wanted to extend it, wasn't it? So this discussion that we just had about the Hanson property was probably not something that was front of mind when you were preparing your evidence.
Yes.
And to some extent, I guess I asked the question, do you have any, is there any particular reason, given the rural lifestyle zone criteria versus the general residential zone criteria, why the land would be better suited to rural lifestyle versus general residential? Given what you've heard?
Generally speaking?
Generally speaking.
Where we've got it.
Yeah.
So why aren't the rural lifestyle zones residential?
No. Very much focusing on this bit of property at 43 Donnelly.
Oh, Donnelly Street.
Yeah, there's a portion of it that's proposed, the split zone between general res and rural lifestyle.
Yeah.
Are there any particular reasons from a landscape perspective why, because at the moment the staff reports identified topographical and infrastructure issues as the reason why not to accept the submission. Haven't identified landscape or rural character or issues, but have they ever entered into your mind around this particular
Yes, and I
zone?
think in the site you've looked at, it's a good example.
Yeah.
In my view, it's a site I do happen to know.
Okay.
It's suited to rural lifestyle because of the minimum lot size, because the character effect of making that more intensive, I think, it would create a harsh transition between then that area and the next zone being the rural zone. So that piece of land, I think, my own view on it, I haven't given evidence on it, is that it's actually steep. Now, while we were talking, I turned the contours on. You know, it's steep land and it's right down next to the river. And if you look at the character of that land relative to the residential next to it and the rural on the other side, I think it's ideal as a transition piece, if you like, for that rural lifestyle living, which is a greater minimum lot size.
But as a general zoning strategy, you don't see every residential zone where it's sort of transitioning to the rural zone interspersed with a rural lifestyle, do you? Rural lifestyle has been very much sort of spot zoned on key areas where the characters change. It's not used as a buffer or a transition zone generally, is it?
No, my own view, I think it should be. We have around the district, we're unusual in a way that we have no zoning buffer between res and rural, and you've only got to drive towards, you know, Okato and see the line of 6-foot fences along the rural boundary, and we get a lot of that harsh res rural divide. But to answer your question, council haven't applied that principle everywhere where we have a res buffer. It's applied to where we have res on the edge of rural, where there are other factors such as a main road or a topography that suits.
The issues, the discussion we just had about this, thanks for that answer, that's helpful. In terms of this particular site that we're talking about, I guess there are two issues. There's overall sort of density, and then there is where you put the built element and where you don't put the built element. I mean, do you perceive though that there is an opportunity for a form of increased residential use on this property that would still preserve a fair amount of it as a transition or an open space sort of buffer to the river edge, based on the topography itself?
Yeah, I think there is, because of the low-lying river next to the low-lying piece next to the river and the Esplanade strip. I mean, there's compelling reasons, because of the proximity to the school and to the village, there's a compelling reason for that to be res. You know, as a character, well, just the proximity, it speaks for itself. So in answer to your question, I think it would depend entirely on how you do it.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Really. You could do it well and it'd be a great transition.
Yep. Yeah.
You could get in there with a digger and create
ruin it. Yeah, you could. And from our perspective, then the issue is what's the best method to ensure that outcome? And we've got some very blunt tools to work with to some extent. We've got this zone and that zone. And unless someone sought a slightly more refined approach to it, we sort of have to really rely on the criteria in the zoning, the subdivision chapters to drive that sort of outcome, don't we? We've just got to be satisfied if we're going to go down that path, that can happen.
That particular piece of land's it's quite complex around there. The river does twist and turns. There's a couple of par sites with bush on them. It's not a straightforward piece of land.
I think everything that's adjacent to that river is not straightforward. We went out to Green School, and I mean, there's some massive issues around out there. Great site, but the river is just incredible to see the valley it's created through there.
And it floods. Well, you know, it's not outside my expertise, but it does flood.
A lot of par sites as well.
Yep.
Richard, you say that New Plymouth's unusual, that we don't have some sort of phasing, like a buffer zone around residential and rural. But I'm not familiar with any plans that have some sort of transitional buffer between residential and rural as well.
I thought that Waikato had a sort of an intermediary size. It's not a plan I'm overly familiar. I thought they had an intermediary size that sort of buffered between the two, but I may be incorrect.
I mean, my experience with Auckland is it's the sort of thing that's evolved over time. So historically, on the edge, the farms would create the odd, 4-acre blocks or 10-acre blocks to supplement a bad year of the dairy payout. And then eventually those areas have become sort of rural lifestyle, and then to almost legitimise them, they've taken on a countryside living or or a different sort of rural zone, and then that in itself has become a planning technique to some extent. Certainly around Auckland, you don't. I mean, you do have those hard edges, and on a district like this, that's the. I mean, it was rural and urban, and that was it really. There wasn't any transitions.
And I'm just adding to that, a lot of the future urban zones and plans that I'm familiar with aren't building in the buffers outside of the urban zone. If they're dealing with them through a structure plan, they won't be building the buffer within the future urban zone. Right. So that it's internal to, and they do that through lot size and setbacks.
When we, I mean, over the years, we've looked at this issue of the rural lifestyle zone a number of times, and just depending on where, you know, there are places, Surrey Hill Road and even the area around Carrington Road, where the land is lumpy and quite unsuited to rural as we know it. So you could have quite vast areas if you sort of used a criteria of, you know, is it crappy rural? Yeah, you can have some quite vast areas of rural lifestyle. But anyway, where we got to eventually is we have got quite discrete areas, very much attached to the edges in specific places.
I think you're exactly right. If you took the criterion that if it's not good for productive rural activities, then you should let it over to living.
Yeah,
you'd end up with masses of rural. I mean, that's right. It's the same north of Auckland. A lot of that land is just rubbish. Yeah. But that's never been a reason just to let it convert to residential, because there's so many other issues that arise when you do that. Yeah. You've got your infrastructure expansion. You've got a whole change of character. Yeah. The other thing I wanted to talk to you about is really the bigger picture issue. When you did your evidence, you wouldn't have had the benefit of seeing the additional work that Mr. Ray and Mr. Campbell have done. I've seen it since. And you've had a good look at it?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And do you, I mean, is there anything you want to say? Give us some further advice on it? I mean,
yes, so when the study that I did, the so-called ResB study that I did in 2018, of course, was before the National Policy Statement on Urban Design. So our criteria were a little different. However, what we did do well in that study, in my view, is we did walk the streets and we did look very specifically at character of streets, the character of the properties within those streets. You know, where was the, you know, if you increase the density, what would occur really? Where would you build a house? Would you take the house away? Would it be a house on the front? And what would be the impact of that? And we took that as an approach. And of course, we also took the approach of looking at where we've got existing centres like the West Town and the Maryland and the Fitzroy, and how can we make those more intensive and vibrant? And I think the vibrancy and intensity was more of a driver than land supply, which has since come in. So our areas, so the areas that I identified in that study are relatively small in extent, and they pretty much are the existing ResB areas in the operative plan with some add-ons. And then my next involvement was really reading the Kainga original submission, which, as you say, is vast. I've since looked at Mr. Ray's evidence, and I think his evidence is really good. He's obviously been to town, he's driven around, he's had a really good look. He still has he's wearing we want to enable lots of land approach. I perhaps disagree with him to that some extent, but overall, I think his evidence is well considered, and there's a lot there I would agree with. In the plan as we have it at the moment, which came from my study, we've got, for example, areas around West Town that are more intense or that are medium density, and then there's a gap to the city. So it's probably logical that the land between the two would become medium density, which I think is what Mr. Ray suggests. So yeah, I think Mr. Ray, he's certainly shrunk the original claim or submission, which I agree needs shrinking in my view.
Certainly in the right of reply, we'd be interested in your views, because we're down about a quarter of what the original submission was seeking. Yes, so certainly interested. the one thing was this character matter, which is in your gambit.
Yeah. When I did my original study, we were concerned about those streets that they may well have proximity, but they have a character, a consistent character along those streets of house and garden, for want of a better term. And we really gave consideration to what would be the effect of change to that in terms of median density. Now, since then, we've now got rules which are kind of similar between the two anyway, because you can now have two houses on each. So that does muddy the waters from my own perspective.
It makes identifying the distinction
Yeah.
harder, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I listened to discussion about this Kaingora's proposal is to have 3 on the medium density. I'm not sure where that's going to land, but those are obviously things that I would could cover in my right of reply in terms of character.
What I'd be interested in is if you could use the same, I guess, terminology that Mr. Ray has done in his evidence, because he's effectively identified, and I sort of tried to scribble it up on their plan yesterday, areas by sort of location. You've got, you've got Spotswood, Marfell, Westtown, Devon Street West, Lower Vogeltown, Upper Vogeltown. If you look at, it'd be quite good, and we've asked Mr. Campbell and Mr. Ray to do a similar sort of Appendix 3 analysis using the criteria to look at the costs and benefits based on those criteria for that. So it might be quite useful once you've seen that, because that'll come in before the right of reply, is to assist us by looking at each of those areas and seeing whether there are character aspects or amenity aspects that ought to dissuade us against the proposal.
Yeah, sure. But area by area.
By area would be really good, because we're going to go out and have a wander around each of these areas now.
Yeah.
Now that we don't have to wander around the whole city.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, running shoes.
Yeah. Now, apparently, men over the age of 40, running's bad for them. Great study. I endorse that one.
Yeah, walking's okay. Walking's good.
That's great. Thanks, Richard. That's helpful.
It's going to be wet for the next two weeks if you're planning on walking in.
Take Rollies on this.
Not much more I can add, Mr. Bain. It was a really interesting day yesterday, and you might want to have a look at the video too.
Sure.
We tested a lot of the aspects of Mr. Ray and Mr. Campbell's evidence, and we had Mr. Liggett from KO also, and benefit of legal submission for Mr. Matheson. But I did actually ask Mr. Ray a question about what was his driver, and he said that his assessment wasn't informed by the quantum that Kaingora was seeking to achieve. In fact, the new figures that were presented yesterday were the first time that he'd seen those figures. So I think that was an important point. He was looking at the suitability of areas for MDR on the merits, regardless of any higher order directive from his client. And it was important that we got that on the record yesterday, and we did. So I just raised that because you were sort of suggesting that he was coming from a particular lens about a driver for achieving a certain quantum, and he refuted that. Further to the table that Mr. Woodruff referred to, I think what Mr. Campbell and Mr. Ray are going to do is they're going to break it down into the 12 areas, and that each of these plans relate to. And if there's any dissection within an area, they'll identify those separately. So area 1 might have 3 components, and area 2 might just have 1. Area 3 might have 4. So, but you'll see that when it comes in anyway.
So what you'd like for me is to, as much as I can, attend to their submission and using the same areas. So you kind of compare and contrast.
Yeah. And for example, you've already given us a bit of a signal about what your thoughts are on the gap between Westtown and City. And so that's possibly area 2, area 3 on their plan. So that's useful, just extending that to the other areas. Where you're in agreement, I think you just need to signal that and adopt their reason. But where you have a different view, we need to know why that view is different.
Yeah, I mean, you've already sort of signalled that there is is potentially room for addition and exclusion of 4.6 of your evidence. Yeah, and you've said it requires a case-by-case consideration. So to some extent, Kaingaroa have now narrowed the scope of it, provided those cases to some extent. I guess the interesting query, sorry David, I'm probably interrupting. You conclude that sentence by saying to determine whether this is in general alignment with the nuanced approach of the Res-B study. Now, of course, the first thing you said to us was that the Res-B study was done prior to the ESUD. And I'm in two minds as to whether that's a factor for us to consider rather than you, or whether it is something we ask you to bear in mind. And I don't know, I don't have a particular view on that, because it is very much a planning imperative rather than a landscape or character-driven assessment, isn't it? Maybe we let Mr. Bain just focus on that aspect. Yes, I don't know.
Well, I was wondering, just listening here, that certainly some analysis from the planners and yourself together.
Yeah, then maybe that's helping you,
Looking-
because you were going to do that.
looking
You'll
in-
do that in your right report.
Looking in the
anyway, so-
round, so.
Oh, sorry, Campbell.
Yeah,
that's Campbell's one.
Yeah, sorry. yeah. Get up here, Mr. Ryan. No, you're right.
So what we heard was that plan, as notified, simply because of the timing, was produced in response to the MPS UDC.
Yeah.
Okay, and that as a tier 2 authority.
The Kaingaroa submission.
No, this is a fact.
Proposed plan.
Proposed plan.
Oh, proposed plan. Yeah.
And presumably, the residential B study was done around the UDC timeframe.
Yeah.
So 2017.
2016, the Res-B was 2018.
So the directors would, I mean, there was still a directive to have sufficient capacity in the UDC, but the directives become more nuanced, more sharp in the UD.
Yeah.
So, and you know, what we heard yesterday is that this council doesn't have a desire to produce a plan change or variation to provide further intensification to give effect to the UD. Unlike some other councils that are tier 2 who are doing their own intensification. So therefore, the scope for doing that is through the Kaingaroa submission, because it takes a whole of plan approach. So
Right.
Not really a question there, that's just an observation. But we did direct planners to provide some information in relation to the different approaches under UDC and UD. You don't need to worry too much about that. Sorry, I lost my thread now, Kit. Sorry. Yeah, no, that were the 2 points. The driver for Mr. Ray's, Mr. Campbell's work was purely in terms of suitability, not in terms of achieving.
Yes.
And the tabular approach. And it's important that we get this in a sequential. We've set Mr. Mattinson and his team quite a bit of homework, haven't we?
Yeah, so I wanted to talk about that with Campbell in the room.
One of the things that I don't know whether Mattinson recorded yesterday was we wanted a third set of plans, which actually show the revised position on top of their existing position, rather than having to compare the two side by side. I'm not sure whether Mr. Mattison's list included that.
I recall you asking for that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think he did in his little summation at the end of that, but we've also captured.
Having that earlier would be useful. And the revised figures and how that relates to Mr. Heath's remodelling. I wasn't too sure how that was going to work, but Stephen, you might have a better idea of what.
No, he confirmed that he will be feeding into the statement of agreed facts on yield and numbers. But if you're finished
that is
with
everything,
Mr. Bain, I think that's clear, Richard.
Yep.
Yes, you know, the plan, certainly you've got your own speciality, but certainly work with Campbell in terms of the right report. Campbell, I did want to have a talk to you about just the plan of attack and also the timetable. Mr. Bell had to shoot off to a plan. We've never really landed dates and deliverables yesterday. So could you please work with Kaingaora and give us a schedule of the process from here, you know, the plan of attack, so we can actually just understand and pick it off. So, you know, we've obviously got information from Kaingaora coming in. We're working together on the pre-statement of facts. You know, so when are we going to receive that information, and then time for your overall reply? So I wouldn't mind just seeing deliverables and a timetable. If you could drive that in concert with Kaingaora team and just provide us as in a note what the proposed timetable is, just so that everyone's clear, particularly so to be Kaingaora and the deliverables, we'll work into an agreed timetable and just liaise with them about their timing. That would be great. Any more?
Awesome.
No.
Fun week.
Yeah, it's been a really, really interesting week. And thank the commissioners for some great questioning. It's been a really, really good hearing, and thank you to the staff again. It's always difficult when you're sort of sitting as reporting officers when, you know, some of the original thoughts are being challenged, and that you've got to sit back and listen to the evidence like we are. Do a bit more thinking and work. So I think the process is tracking along really well, and I appreciate your effort. And Julie, I think we can probably adjourn the hearing now, and we'll come back at 9 o'clock on Monday.